Good. Well, I would like to welcome everyone here today. It's great to be able to see some old friends. There's old friends both in Norway and on the webinar today. It's good to see you. I'm glad to meet new friends. We always welcome people as that. And I just wanted to notice Charles Reed, I see you sitting at the table in Norway. It's great that he's able to travel. We look forward to the opportunity for all of us to be able to travel as well, maybe to meet in one room sometime in the future. I want to recognize Marion and Palak and Lee for the work that they've done in putting this together. I kind of taken the initiative and they've done the work behind the scenes, so I want to thank them for that. Just want to do a brief introduction to IPPFoRB. For almost 10 years, IPPFoRB has been an integral part in the fight for FoRB around the globe. And as many of you may know, some may not, in 2014, there were a group of parliamentarians that came together in Oxford in June and then met again in November in Oslo. And we signed on to what was called the Oslo Charter, which was basically a declaration of support for common goals around the issue of freedom of religion or belief. And basically what it focused on was Article 18 of the UN Declaration, which says that people have the right to believe, they have the right to change that belief, and they have the right to live out those beliefs. And so from 2014 until today, we've worked to try to establish those principles, and we work particularly with legislators around the world. It's the IPPFoRB stands for the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief. We've had a number of different partners. It's been great to have the partnerships that we've had. The Norwegian government has been a great partner. Stephanus Alliance and Norwegian Helsinki committees have hosted IPPFoRB for a number of years. We worked with CAS, with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, on a number of larger events. Church of England has been a partner with us on many different occasions. United States Commission, we've done some work and initiatives with them. Lately, we've been working with the FoRB Leadership Network. Charles Reed is a part of that. International Roundtable Development, we've been part of that initiative out of Washington. And the IRFBA Alliance, we have people on that steering group for that, as well as participating in their events. So had an opportunity to have a lot of different contacts around the globe with various organizations and initiatives. We've also had larger gatherings in 2015, 2017, 2019. First was in New York, and then in Berlin, and in Singapore. We had very active support of the German government and Chancellor Merkel in Berlin in 2017, and the Singapore government sent senior representatives to our meetings in 2019. So it's been great to be able to partner with governments around the world as well. Done a number of different things in terms of advocacy. We've had advocacy letters that have gone out signed by our network members. So parliamentarians who are part of the network have gotten copies of letter and then have been asked to forward them to embassies of countries in their own nation. And that seems to have worked fairly effectively on some of the issues. We've developed toolkits for FoRB to give people the basics of what FoRB is, how they can begin to work on it and work on those issues. We've held the Oxford Academies, we call them, for legislators, where they can come in and they could just spend a few days with other legislators, with some experts and academics discussing the notions of FoRB and how it might apply in their countries. And then one of the things that we really tried to focus on is trying to establish regional and national groups of legislators in their own country or own region to work on the issues of FoRB. And we have had networks in places like Latin America and Nepal. We have a very active African network with AFRIPAR right now. We've been part of CFoRB as well. So we've had these international alliances and networks that have advanced the cause of FoRB as well. And the focus has always been on trying to establish and support legislators and the people who want to work with them. So as I mentioned, when we came together in 2014, the commitment was a very simple one. And we just told the principle that everyone has the right to believe. They have the right to change that belief if they choose to do that, and they have the right to live out those beliefs. And those commitments, we believe, involves two things. They involve a right and a responsibility. And the right is that each one of us can believe as we choose. The responsibilities that we allow and that we work with others to allow them to do the same. And the caveat, of course, is that no one has the right to coerce another person in their beliefs. Those freely held beliefs lead to variety. We believe not to the sameness. If we allow for freedom, then we do not require or expect that every person will come to the same set of beliefs. And while I think some may assume that uniformity is the goal, or sameness is the goal, the objective, there is a much better one. And that is that we simultaneously hold our own beliefs with confidence while we allow and encourage other people to do the same. And I believe this is the challenge for FoRB in the 21st century, that people would be the source of, or would be comfortable with their own beliefs, secure in their own beliefs, and at the same time would have the courage and the maturity to allow other people to disagree with us. It's only when that occurs, I believe, that we can find any meaningful discussion about real distinctives about faith or about faiths. And as we move into our panel and discussion today, we already know that faith is a very real source of moral courage for many individuals and communities. It's the focal point of advocacy, not just for freedom of religion or belief, but also for things like dignity, equity, justice, and for peace. So IPPFoRB has had a unique emphasis on parliamentarians. There are focuses, we try to build the networks, as I mentioned, but our interest is not just in legislators, it's also in creating connections between elected leaders and religious and lay leaders for whom FoRB is important. And I believe this IPPFoRB panel does just that. It brings together parliamentarians and faith leaders who have dedicated their lives to reaching across divides and building coalitions to promote a more just and inclusive world, with the goal of allowing all people, all individuals, that right to enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms. And so I'd like to turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Aykan Erdemir. Dr. Erdemir is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is a former member of the Turkish parliament. He was co-drafter of the first hate crimes bill in Turkey. He now serves on ADL's task force on Middle Eastern minorities. He is a founding member of IPPFoRB, and he currently serves on IPPFoRB steering group, and he is also a recipient of the 2016 Stephanus Prize for Religious Freedom. He's a thinker, he's an author, researcher, and today he is the moderator of our panel. So Aykan, take it away.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction and also a wonderful overview of IPPFoRB, its traditions, core values, and goals. And it truly is a privilege on my end to be able to moderate today's stellar lineup of panelists, some of whom have been longtime colleagues, some friends, some new friends. They have all demonstrated outstanding moral courage in advocating for freedom of religion or belief. And they have all led efforts to build bridges, form alliances, and bring about impactful social and political change. So it is such a privilege. So a very apt lineup for a session titled Moral Courage in Action, Building Alliances and Legislating Change. So without further ado, let me introduce them to you. Farahnaz Isfahani is a world-renowned journalist, scholar, a former member of Pakistan's National Assembly. She is also a steering group member of IPPFoRB and a member of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, and until recently, its rotating co-chair. I strongly recommend her book, Purifying the Land of the Pure, A History of Pakistan's Religious Minorities. Our second speaker is Reverend Rob Schenck, who is an ordained evangelical minister with a distinguished career of over 40 years. He is the founder and president of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. He is also a member of the US Senate Chaplain's Emergency Pastoral Response Team. I again strongly recommend his latest book, Costly Grace, An Evangelical Minister's Rediscovery of Faith, which I first read in print and then listened in audiobook format from Rob's own voice, and I strongly recommend it. The sentiments really come across. Our third speaker is Reverend Marion Edmonds. Ellen is the executive director of Parity, a New York City-based national nonprofit that works at the intersection of faith and LGBT concerns. She is also the director of Blessed by Difference. In 2013, Marion was named Person of the Year by Q Salt Lake for her visionary leadership. Thank you, Marion. And the last but not least is our superstar, Kasturi Patto, who is a member of the Malaysian Parliament, always very busy, but still makes time. She's a member of the steering group of IPPFoRB. And on top of all that, she is the newly elected president of the Parliamentarians for Global Action. She is a significant leader, not only in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, but also globally, and has been doing an amazing job. And she's joining now, after a very hard, long legislative day in Malaysia, late into the night, and that shows you how dedicated she is. So let me move with our first round of questions. Farahnaz, I'll turn to you. You have an amazing life story itself, which would make a Hollywood movie. But with all the the challenges and risks and threats, as well as all the achievements, could you discuss your own experience from journalism to parliament, your experience with the slain Pakistani minister Shahbaz Bhatti, your work on blasphemy, on religious minorities in Pakistan and beyond? How did all these issues played a transformative role in your kind of moral leadership and legislative activity?
Thank you so much, Ikan, for that extremely generous introduction. Today's topic is fascinating and I think extremely, extremely important. And to give you just a little bit of a quick personal overview, I will tell you, as a child, I first became aware of what freedom of religion and belief meant as a Shia Muslim. On the holy day of Ashura, I remember praying. We were all praying in our mosque, and the mosque was surrounded by tanks and anti-artillery groups, and we had jackbooted military people in every corner on the most holy and the deepest day of mourning for Shia Muslims. I understood that day that for us to have to be protected in a Muslim majority country, there was something very wrong. So I was perhaps maybe 7 or 8 at that time. Flash forward today. To give you an idea, we're talking about moral courage, but let's look at where we are today in a situation where we see, even among parliamentarians, many who are not showing that moral courage, and why that is so crucial today for parliamentarians all over South Asia, all over Asia, and all over the world. Pakistan has only been an intermittent democracy, as you know, and its religious minorities have faced repression for decades. Anti-minority bigotry has been normalized in Pakistan. Mob violence in the name of guarding against blasphemy is commonplace. You might recall recent media reports of the burning alive by a mob of a Sri Lankan factory manager over totally fabricated blasphemy charges. In an environment where the government machinery protects rather than acting against the mob, speaking out or legislating against prejudice and to face the bigotry of mobs requires the deepest form of moral courage. It is putting your life on the line in a very real sense. Most politicians choose today in Pakistan to pander to the bigoted mob and to secure votes. Some think staying quiet is the most courageous thing they can manage to do. I, however, was lucky to serve in Pakistan's parliament at a time when a military dictator, Pervez Musharraf, had just been forced out of power by our democratic opposition parties. Civilian politicians were at least trying to make an effort to exercise powers given to them by the country's constitution at that time. Since then, civilian influence unfortunately has eroded, and the deep state of Pakistan's military and intelligence service has become firmly in charge. When I served in Parliament from 2008 to 2012, I worked very closely with a Catholic Christian parliamentary colleague named Shahbaz Bhatti, who was also the Minister for Religious Affairs at that time, and also with the governor of the Punjab province, Pakistan's largest, Governor Salman Taseer. And we were all attempting to try and reform Pakistan's anti-minority laws. And it was coming together of people. Salman Taseer was a majority Sunni Muslim. Shahbaz had worked and was a voice of the Christian community in Pakistan as an advocate, and in so many ways for decades before he even came into the parliament. And then there was me. We were trying very hard because, as I said before, the blasphemy laws all over the world now, as has been established, but in Pakistan, I would say alongside with Iran, we have the harshest blasphemy laws in the world. And both Shahbaz, who sat just beside me in Parliament, and Governor Taseer were both gunned down, assassinated, and murdered. Governor Taseer by his own police bodyguard, and Shahbaz by an assassin, only for standing up for a poor Christian woman who, under mere allegations of blasphemy, had been accused wrongly and jailed. And her name is Asia Bibi, and today, by the grace of God and the work of many brave activists in Pakistan and the international community, she is alive and well and living in Canada. So, you know, moral courage does bring results. In countries like Pakistan, you often may pay with your life, or for someone like myself, by the grace of God, I'm living in the United States now, and I'm able to write books on these issues and speak and spread the word, because so many in Pakistan cannot. So that is, you know, where I am today, with this very hard task in front of me, though there are so many brothers and sisters in Pakistan doing the same work underground. And we have built alliances, and their names and their organizations can't be named here today publicly, but they exist. And so I've just, you know, put in front of you what moral courage looks like, what real moral courage looks like, and how the inspiration of these two colleagues has stayed with me all these years. Thank you.
And thank you, Farahnas, for that moving account. I can see that we're feeling, you know, what moral courage is, and the costs really brave individuals pay for freedom, rights and freedoms. Marion, let me turn to you. You and I share one common denominator, that is, we have both done work in the intersection of faith and LGBT rights. You know, when I was an anti-discrimination trainer as part of Turkey's anti-homophobia days, I had that transformative experience, because when I was lecturing, there was a young Turkish lesbian who asked a question after my talk and said, I am a person of faith, but I've never shared this with my colleagues, with my LGBT colleagues here. But after I hear your talk about people of faith, you know, LGBT people of faith, now I would like to share it. And that was transformative for me, because here was some of the most progressive individuals in Turkey who prided themselves of being very open-minded. But at the same time, one of their very own colleagues didn't feel safe enough or free enough to come out that she was a person of faith, because there was a misconception that the two issues were mutually exclusive. Now, you are not only a living example and proof that LGBT individuals exist and they can play leadership roles in faith communities, but also you have demonstrated a lot of moral courage to take public action across the United States and beyond. Your great work with parity, opening up space for LGBT faith leaders and lay people is remarkable. Could you share with us also your journey, some of the experiences and also individuals that touched you and your life and your work?
I can't thank you. It's such an honor to be here. My journey to what I do now, to parity, wasn't anything that I could have or would have planned. But instead, my journey reflects what I believe is God's calling on my life to be, as you say, an example, a human bridge of LGBT in faith. I am the person that usually scares someone in a room. As everyone can see by my clothing, I am an ordained Christian minister, but I am also a gender non-binary LGBT person, a woman married to a woman. And when I speak to an in-person audience, I can watch people react, sometimes recoil, when they learn about me. There is usually something about me that is frightening to someone. For many LGBT people who have been told the lie that God hates them, the fact that I'm a minister can be scary to them. And for others who have never met an LGBT person before, well, that can be pretty scary too. The labels society uses to promote fear rather than understanding. And I have felt that fear in my life from labels as well, but God had other plans for me. I had been married to a man for almost 20 years before finding myself single. He moved on from our marriage and our family and our 4 young children. I needed to find a way to support my kids as a single mom, and it was then that I revisited an early call to the ministry. I went to theological school and completed the ordination process. But it was during my years as a hospital chaplain and at the age of 40 that I met my very first LGBT person that I knew of. And as an evangelical Christian, I will admit that I was afraid and a little bit repelled. But then over time, I came to realize that I was LGBT as well. Not something I had planned for my life. And frankly, it was a time of soul searching and questioning of God and of my faith. But then I realized that God was calling me to a new life. A new life. I moved to Utah and I began working with homeless LGBT youth. I started a church in Salt Lake City and ran a youth center, working to prevent suicide and to get legal shelter for children and teens sleeping in the canyons and squats and even in a tree outside Temple Square in Salt Lake City. I became an LGBT activist and got good at making headlines, but I wasn't making any headway. I was trying desperately to change the laws that prohibited unaccompanied youth from access to homeless shelters. Even on the coldest of nights, there was no place for homeless youth, children, to go. But it all changed the day I met a legislator and his aide. Both were skeptical that there were any homeless youth in Utah. So I invited them to visit my youth center, and they met some homeless youth. And then they became champions for those youth. We worked together to change the state laws, and it seemed a miracle, but homeless youth no longer had to sleep in the snow and could access shelters. The legislator I had met were as opposite from me as you can imagine. And yet we became colleagues and then dear friends and have continued to work together on state and national legislation that helped the people and community we cared about together. I not only believe that change is possible through collaboration across difference, I have seen it firsthand. When people are free to see each other without labels blocking our vision, we are able to see colleagues, neighbors, friends. And the goals that seem out of reach, like helping children to have a safe and warm place to sleep, are not only possible, they are achievable. The reality is, I'm not that scary. I'm one of many LGBT people who are also people of faith. More than half of LGBT people actually identify as people of faith. And there are growing numbers of LGBT people in the world too. So people won't need to wait until they are 40, like I did, to meet their first LGBT person. I believe that everyone deserves the chance to have a relationship with God if they choose. Religious freedom is for everyone, everywhere, all the time. And that includes LGBT people like me, no exceptions. And for LGBT people and others who don't identify with a religious tradition or faith, those of us who care about religious freedom need to keep non-believers in our hearts and by our side as we work together for human dignity for all people, no exceptions. And I see it happening. The good news is that despite scary headlines of division and hatred, what I see much more often are people who long to connect with their neighbors. I see people who want to make a difference in the world, who care about those in need. We just need to find each other, to talk and listen and work together to make our world the best it can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, for that really moving talk. And I think that's a perfect segue to also Rob's work and efforts, who has also done work similar to you, worked with at-risk youth, but also he has been a risk taker at the forefront of advocacy and outreach. He was one of the hidden or lesser known heroes behind. You might remember there was that one crisis of Quran burning in Florida. And it took people like Rob to reach out and to diffuse tensions and to end that crisis and literally save lives. Rob is also at the forefront of great work against guns and gun violence as well. And he has the most remarkable journey, just like Marion. And that's why I strongly urge you to read Costly Grace. But without further ado, Rob, you can do a much better job of telling your amazing life story than I can.
Thank you, Icon, for the invitation to be with you. It's good to see your face again after such a long time, and to be in such good company. As we evangelicals say, I feel like I'm in church. I'm inspired, I'm enriched by the stories and the concepts and the realities that we've already discussed. When you contacted me, you asked me to tell a little of the story of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, which I head here in Washington. And there's a reason that I do at this stage of my career. I usually introduce myself as a kind of penitent pilgrim, because I spent nearly 30 years on the hard right, advancing ideas that I am now aware of as being very harmful, injurious, destructive to others. And I deeply regret that. And I carry it as a point of hopefully constructive pain in my own life. But it was the posthumous guidance of this young, brave, brilliant church leader in World War II Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who helped lead me onto a better path in my life. And with his continued help, I'm trying to make up for some of that damage, do some atoning work, and hopefully make the world around me a little better with as much time as I might have. At 63, I'm starting to count the days. I don't have as long as I used to have, but I'll try to make every day count. And I do that principally these days through the leadership of the Bonhoeffer Institute. As I said, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a young, brave, and very brilliant thinker, but also activist. And his principles, his ideas, his insights were tested in the crucible of a world literally melting under war, and with millions of victims spread across Europe, arguably to many other regions of the world. And of course, Bonhoeffer would pay for his resistance to Adolf Hitler's racialized dictatorship with his own life, when at age 39, he was executed by the Nazis at the Flossenburg concentration camp, but not before he left us a wonderful literary legacy, a library of correspondence, papers, and books. I have the full collection right over my head where it belongs in those blue volumes. If you haven't read Bonhoeffer, I urge you to do so, particularly on the subject of ethics. His magnum opus, Ethics, is really his most telling work. And what I do today is my colleagues and I take these brilliant insights, tested in the worst of conditions, and apply them to the exigencies of our own day, helping to shape, form, and resource young, morally and ethically courageous leaders in all sectors of society, but particularly in religion and in politics. And they prove themselves useful over and over again. Of course, all ethics are relative to time, place, situation. You know, the one thing you can't do, because Bonhoeffer prohibits us from doing it, is to mimic him. Everything is specific to one's own time and place. So that's the reason Dietrich Bonhoeffer is my companion, and he's very present, I think, today. He was way ahead of his time, and he will help us again today. So I commend him to you. As far as the Quran incident, this came at a time when I was in transition in my own life. A pastor in Florida had announced his intention to burn a tower of Qurans, actually not Qurans, but interpretations of the Quran, as a symbol of his contempt for Islam. And he had held a moot court to try the Prophet Muhammad, found him to be a malignant figure in history, a false prophet, and was going to express his contempt by creating this inferno. I watched with some distress because, of course, I knew the implications of this would be very far-reaching in every possible way. And then I got a phone call from an official at the Pakistan desk in our US State Department, who said, "This is one of your own. He's an evangelical, a fundamentalist. Can you do nothing? Please help us here to diffuse this possible explosion of tension in Pakistan and other places in the world." I took that under advisement. I went to a colleague. We flew the 90-minute flight to Florida from Washington and appealed to this fellow evangelical pastor on a particular basis, and this is what I'd like to emphasize. We have to find the place where we meet with those who have a religious worldview. And I knew there were all kinds of arguments that could be made here, but the one I was sure would win was this, that if he proceeded with this burning, he would place at risk Christian workers all over the world, particularly in Islamic countries, and most certainly in Pakistan. And that's the basis that I appealed to him. I said, Pastor, if you proceed with this, no doubt you will place lives at risk. You will likely have Christian workers expelled from Pakistan, if not prosecuted, and perhaps worse. And the responsibility for this will lie on your shoulders. Now, mind you, he had already placed a pistol on his desk between him and me. I had been met by a phalanx of black suited security guards who were heavily armed with semi-automatic rifles and handguns. So that was the environment we were in. And he looked at me and studied me and said, I will think about it. A few hours later, he announced his intentions to call off the burning. I acted with dispatch and immediately took the Qurans into safekeeping, brought them up to Washington and distributed them to friends and colleagues in the Islamic community. But I did keep one just as a memento of a terrible time. And I treasure that because of the outcome. Now, eventually, a year later, he would do it, but not as quite the spectacle, and he had far fewer volumes, and no one was paying any attention. So we were able to diffuse the tension there. And it would be shortly after that, I would take on the gun issue in my own evangelical community, because we are a subset of the American population most likely to own firearms and to defend unfettered use of them. So I've learned my own lessons in moral courage. I can't say I'm an expert in it. I am still learning and have a lot to learn. And that's why we need each other today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for also demonstrating that moral courage comes always with humility. And, I think both Marion's story and your story also shows us how moral courage can make a difference and how individuals change, because that's also the hope that we can also make a change in life. But let me now turn to, without further ado, Kasturi Pato. Kasturi, I remember during my days in Parliament, after a long legislative marathon, I would come home late into the night and I would be so tired, even to, watch a minute of TV or, do anything else. And we so admire you that you, in the middle of really a marathon, you can make time for us late into the night in Malaysia. Could you tell us your own amazing story, in the Parliament, now with PGA, with IPPFoRB in Southeast Asia, your working in a Muslim majority country where a lot of the dynamics we've been talking about, tolerance, intolerance, inclusion, exclusion are very much, at work.
Thank you very much, Icon, and to my esteemed friends and panelists, Reverend Marion, Mr. Rob, and Faranas, and David for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. It's 11:43 p.m. in Malaysia now, but I'm actually really excited, and I thank the IPPFoRB for giving me this opportunity to share maybe just a little bit of my journey being a part of IPPFoRB as a lawmaker, as a minority in my country. I think the story of IPPFoRB is the more you know, the less you know. And the thing is, and that is the drive that pushed me to indulge in FoRB. It wasn't something that I had thought about earlier when I became a member of parliament. But then over being exposed, meeting fellow colleagues and MPs in Oslo, resulted in me coming back to Malaysia with a renewed idea, a mindset to touch on this subject that has always been frowned upon in Malaysia. In Malaysia, we have a dual court system. We have civil courts and we have Sharia courts, which means that some cases are always stuck right in the middle between the gray area, whether it should be heard in a Sharia court and a civil court. And those are issues that are linked very close to FoRB. I also, over the years, attending conferences and networking and meeting fellow MPs, just widened my horizon, and I just got better at my arguments as well. Because the issue of FoRB is always very, very touchy. It's very sensitive, and it irks me that the word tolerance is often used with freedom of religion and belief. And I always felt that tolerance is, it's a threshold, it's a level of how much you can tolerate, how much you can put up with. And that is just no way to look at how a state or a government or an entity or even a parliament for that matter should ever look at an issue of freedom of religion and belief. It should encompass universal values of respect, of living in harmony, of embracing diversity, of understanding beliefs, cultures, etc. So when you use a word like tolerance, then there is a sort of a situation of a majority and minority situation. And I also learned this at an IPPFoRB forum of what is a siege mentality. It is when the majority starts to behave like a minority and they feel threatened, and then they become more oppressive and they become, you know, ultra sensitive to everything and anything around them. And that further divides the gap between ethnicities, between people of belief and people even of who don't come from a background of religion. And I think that's just not the way forward for a nation. I was looking at some data, looking at statistics, and how FoRB is also very closely linked to economy, and countries that have a lot of oppression, a lot of moral police, for lack of a better word, and also institutionalized racism and institutionalized bigotry, religious bigotry within the system, countries that display lower GDPs. And also countries that very quickly fill up the spot on the worst human rights abuses as well, even if it's not FoRB, any other form of gender-based violence, whether it's on migrant issues and refugees and corruption, abuses of power, sexism, misogyny, and the list is endless. In the Malaysian context, a few years ago, I had debated in the Malaysian Parliament on the speech that was made by my Minister of Foreign Affairs at the UN General Assembly. And I had quoted the report from Yusuf. Malaysia is at tier 2 on freedom of religion and belief. And I believe that there is room for improvement, but you must address the elephant in the room. You have to talk about it. It is often the extremists and the radicals who don't want to talk about it from a very open, positive, academic point of view, because the only argument they have is emotional. And when you counter that with facts and figures, they don't want to accept it, and they further drive the conversation towards, just holding on to what they believe in, etc. I did make a few comments about enforced disappearances in Malaysia. Pastor Raymond was abducted in broad daylight on the 14th of February in 2017. It was the same day the brother of Kim Jong-un was assassinated in Malaysia, in our airport. But the highlight was on the assassination and less on the abduction of Pastor Raymond. We have even a Muslim religious leader who was abducted in 2014 in a northern state in Malaysia, and his whereabouts is still not known. A few years down the line, we've had also another two husband and wife who had been abducted or disappeared. And of course, a series of other threats against men and women who are religious leaders who have disappeared from Malaysia's backyard. These are some of the things I spoke about, including the government's duty to protect people of faith, that they are protected and given that safe space to profess their faith freely. Malaysia frowns upon spreading other religions to Muslims. That is in the federal constitution. It's an offense, which we understand and respect. However, we have to speak of the other minority groups and their right to profess and practice their faith freely. After having made that statement, it was twisted. My speech was twisted by some radical groups. There were police reports against me, calling for me to be investigated under the Sedition Act. And some good friends who called me to say that there were groups who were looking for my home address and where I lived, etc. Of course, I shared this with the then member Ed Brown, and he immediately responded by asking me if I needed any support from USERV or from IPPFoRB, etc., which was very comforting, and which again reminded me the function of what IPPFoRB is, which is to network and to offer support and to share with MPs toolkits, or rather, in other words, survival kits when you speak about FoRB in your individual parliaments. From then, I realized that this is something that the naysayers don't want to talk about, which has driven me to speak about it even more. And more MPs are speaking about it as well in the Malaysian parliament. But of course, you know, these kind of subjects are often, they become your best friend or they become your worst enemy, depending on the political situation in your country. And with this COVID pandemic, which has given rise to suspicion, a great suspicion, and, you know, anti-vaxxers theory, and then that feeds into religion, etc. It just makes it that much harder to speak about FoRB. But it is this kind of situation that makes you think out of the box. How do you want to present the topic of FoRB and make it a mainstream subject? Today, the whole world's talking about Russia and Ukraine, but somewhere in that whole hostility, in that war, there would be casualties of FoRB which we are overlooking and we are not seeing and we're not giving enough attention to. And I think that's where world leaders also need to step in to ensure that in a time of crisis, that these voices of people of faith, or even people who come from a background of no faith, who are atheists, are protected as a civilian in the eyes of the law. I think my time is up, and again, I thank ICANN for giving me this platform, and I hope I've answered the question. And I do have a lot of things to say, but I want to hear from everyone else on the panel. Thank you, ICANN. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kasturi. You're always amazing. And, you know, before I go to my light, thank you, Kasturi, always amazing. And before I go to my lightning round, in which I reached out to our panelists for some like take-home messages, for some key lessons from their own experiences about how faith and, you know, freedom of religion or belief and legislative change comes together. I see some lawmakers among our audience and would like to put some of them on the spot, because I know some of their work is very relevant for us, so that we can include that in the conversation. Ksenia, if I can turn to you and put you on the spot. Now, Ksenia Svetlova is a former member of the Israeli parliament, and she has done remarkable work with a number of Arab countries, and before the Abraham Accords, not in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, but in the run-up to Abraham Accords. So Ksenia, if you could just take maybe 2 to 3 minutes to tell us about your work across nations, faiths and borders.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that the sound is okay.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you to you, Ican, for inviting me for your very inspiring words. I think that these challenging times are the best suitable time to talk about moral courage. If we will not talk about moral courage right now, when our governments and our parliaments need to make right decisions and to be on the right side of the history, then when it's suitable to talk about it. Referring to the theme of our today's discussion, I wanted also to share the experience of running a parliamentary caucus in Israel that I established to protect and promote the importance of Jewish heritage in Arab and Muslim countries. I established this caucus back in 2015, and it was long before the Abraham Accords. Though there was already work in process with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, but still it was something that was very, very, very remote. And many of my friends in Israel told me at the time, that you cannot go there and as an Israeli, you are not welcome there as a Jews. And when I started the caucus and I was starting to reaching out to people, I was astonished at how much support did I get. Message in Libya, in Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan specifically, but also Gulf, and many other countries, which were brave people. They said that they want to cooperate.
Ksenia, I think we've lost you. But hopefully we'll get back to you. But I think that's an important lesson for all of us, that often when we show moral courage, we're then met with other individuals who also show moral courage. And that's, I think, a great foundation for the building of such bridges. Ksenia, would you like to conclude if your connection is
Yes,
working?
I think it's better. I think it's better now. So I just, briefly to conclude, I can tell you that sometimes think that things that happen to us, we create our reality. So when we started talking to our friends in Morocco, Muslims in Europe, and discussing, how we can promote together and protect the holy places that are left to us, to the descendants, to make the best, to protect them, then, in very short time, I found out that the circle is reaching and the message is going, and it's not longer depend on me, but it's like a bird that you send free, and it has its own life. And of course, when the Abrahamic Accords was signed, I said, wow, this is more that I could hope for. I researched Middle East for many years. And all of us, we sometimes want to focus on the negative sides, intolerance. There is plenty of that. The destructive regimes, dictatorships, but there is also another side. There is this beauty and understanding, and good people who want to promote our common faith, that the good is possible. It's not that in our world.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. And again, Besa Ismaili, feel free to say no, but I would like to put you on the spot, because you as a lawmaker from Kosovo, a post-conflict society, I'm sure you have very important lessons for us when it comes to, dealing with trauma, reaching across ethnicities and faiths and borders, and most importantly, healing. Would you be able to share some of your experiences and insights?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share these stories, which coming from a small society, compared to yours from Kosovo, I think they are really inspiring, because the smaller the society, I believe, the bigger are the prejudices and the blockages, refrains or constraints that we put. The walls actually are bigger. This is, I can tell this from my experience in the Balkan. But in spite of everything, there are always these moments that you have been all talking about of moral courage, that once you take a stand, then you get connected and you get even surprised very positively of how much support and like-minded people you will find from the other side of the wall. So many that the walls in one certain momentum, they simply get shattered and disappear. And then this work becomes your very inspiration and motivation to move on. I mean, to break as many walls as we can. I remember immediately after the war, Kosovo Serbs were living in small cities, in enclaves, and of course they continue with their world and life, and we continued with our own, having absolutely no interaction. And I remember that it was a woman of faith, of different faiths of Kosovo, 4 of them, who said, you know what, we need to reach out to the woman in let's say, in Gračanica or the Orthodox monastery, because simply, I mean, we were together before the war and we live here, and we just want to say hello. In those times there was, and still is actually, international presence in Kosovo, and I remember KFOR was the one to say, hey, where are you going? I mean, are you crazy? It was very unpopular momentum politically also, because for Albanians to go to extend a hand to the Serbs, and the Albanians have suffered so much in Kosovo, they still had the furiousness and of course they dealt with lots of atrocities of the war. I mean, how can you talk to a Serb? And let alone you are going to a church, which in the discourse of that time, it was very much pushing for the war that had actually happened both in Bosnia and in Kosovo. But I remember that we also had some discussions internally saying, what if, I mean, Svetlana will not be able to accept us, because of course she also has her own difficulties and constraints within the monastery. But I mean, it was me and it was another lady from the Catholic Church who said, I mean, even if somebody pushes us back or even if we got beaten, we have to do this. We just have to do this and try it. And only then we can conclude that we are not wanted or that they don't want to have any contact with us. And when we entered the monastery in Gračanica, I still have these flashes. These women were actually crying of happiness to have seen us in those moments. And we saw that they have been dealing with lots of refugees, internally displaced persons. And we just, I mean, we had that absolutely very, very good time in the sense that we really felt each other. We had this great momentum of empathy, which resulted afterwards with solidarity and help. I mean, we gathered in-kind assistance. And I remember, and this is very, very teaching to everyone, and I keep telling this to my students, 6 months after the same people have actually pointed the fingers of to us, like how less Albanians we are because we go to the Serb places, to the Serb churches, they were running for election. And when the international community was very expressed fond of our action, they started to actually compete. Who is going to be the first to go and visit them in these places? So there is this political hypocrisy that's always there battling with this moral courage. And once we win, or once the momentum of a moral courage triumph, then you see all the others going after. But there is always this first step that needs to be taken. And I think it's these steps that you also shared with us here, very moving and very inspiring, need to be documented, written, and taught to students so that more and more of these situations actually spark and break through different walls that we all have in our surroundings.
And thank you, Bessa, for sharing that. As a former member of Turkey-Kosovo caucus, who has had thank you, Bessa, for that story. And as a former member of the Turkey-Kosovo caucus, who has had many trips to Kosovo, I can understand how challenging that could be and how great moral courage you have demonstrated in reaching out. And that's really inspiring for all of us. So before I turn to our panelists for the last lightning round, let me ask whether Ramakrishnan Suppiah, a former member of the Malaysian Parliament, who is also with us, would like to share a few thoughts and insights. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I'm a former member of Malaysian Parliament, and I'm also a former member of the State Assembly, which is dissolved and now is going for re-election, but I am not contesting. Yes, religion is a very sensitive topic in Malaysia, as narrated by YB Kasturi. We are in a very divisive society where the majority race and religion has all the privileges, and the political system also is monopolized by them. And we have two laws, Sharia law and civil law, and there are many areas where we do have conflicts, especially when there is interaction between, for example, in the issue of conversion, we have very sensitive cases, and so far there is no violence, but sometimes it is very sensitive. But of course, the majority has their way and the minority give in. And there is no violence yet, so therefore we are able to accept. But things are not improving. It is becoming more and more difficult. But nobody wants violence, so we give in. We give in, and we do not know where it's leading to. I only hope that religious leaders, all religious leaders, become more, not say tolerance, accept our differences. We are born in a certain religion. It's not our fault, and we should be able to accept each other's religion. And religion should not be a divisive force, but as narrated by other panelists, religion has become a very divisive force. In the case of LGBTs, it's not their fault. It is very natural. Why can't religion accept them as a human being? Why religion find it so difficult to accept? So I think we need more wider interpretation, more acceptance, and accommodation of all our differences. I think that is the biggest issue now all over the world, where the majority has a lot of an advantage position, and minorities finding it difficult. So it also becomes a human rights issue. So therefore, I hope FoRB can play a more major role, and FoRB can also do the wider interpretation, a broader interpretation, and not leave it to the religious leaders who always have a very narrow interpretation. I think these are the issues on the ground. We hope through FoRB we can play a bigger role, and we have the moral courage also to take up these challenges. Thank you very much for the opportunity again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramakrishnan. Thank you for your valuable contributions. Now, we will move on to the Q&A shortly, but in a lightning round, can I go through our panelists? And I have just one short question, and that is, what would you recommend either legislators or advocates in terms of bringing about legislative change. You can approach this either from your advocate position or from your lawmaker position. In your own experience, like if you could have one wisdom to share with lawmakers or with advocates, what would it be? For example, my own would be, let me kick this off. As an academic / advocate, I used to do a lot of work reaching out, trying to change policy, trying to set up an anti-discrimination equality board in Turkey, trying to push for an hate crimes bill. But when I was in parliament, I realized that I wish as an advocate, I could be more concise, that instead of lengthy reports or demands, I could come with one-pagers, realizing how little time lawmakers have, how short their attention span happens to be, and also how busy their agendas are. So for example, this would be my one wisdom by doing it wrong, first as an academic / advocate, and then seeing it from the other side of the table. Farahnaz, can I begin with you?
Sure. To begin with, I just want to say to the honorable former lawmaker from Malaysia, who is also a member of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, I'm honored to have been elected an associate member because I come from a country outside ASEAN. The number one thing I would say is organizations like the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, APHR, IPPFoRB, as we see working on the steering group with all the parliamentarian members we have from all over the world, reach out nationally, reach out regionally, reach out internationally. Because often when you can't raise your voice on something, you will find lawmakers in countries around you or countries very far away who can take up that issue and bring to it clarity and bring to it strength and conviction. And as I look at freedom of religion and belief, or none, I do work through a human rights lens. People come to it from different lenses, but I do come to it from a human rights lens. So I think very much, number one, organizations like this are an absolute savior. The second thing is to understand policy and policy button. For example, in Pakistan, we have been working, those of us, advocates, activists, former lawmakers, some lawmakers or government servants quietly to get the Europeans to take away something called GSP Plus, which will directly impact Pakistan's economy. Because of the blasphemy laws, because of the apostasy laws, because of their treatment of Pakistan's non-Muslim minorities, because of the lynchings and killings and forced conversions of young women from Hindu and Christian communities, etc., etc. So that is, for example, that is an economic button that can be pushed. Aid is another one that, for example, in the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom often advocates for not exactly suspension of aid, but that is something towards putting, again, pressure on that country to stop or desist, or at least pretend to normalize situations. But I will give you a personal example of two things. Fellow lawmakers could not understand why I, as a Muslim, spent so much time on the floor of the House, calling attention notices. Every time I could get the mic, I would be on it. And I would always be talking about minority Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities, and brutal killings, murders, assassinations, communities burnt, villages burnt, which nobody in the parliament was even bringing up. So lawmakers have so many, I don't want to say one thing. There are all these ways you can use your voice. And finally, what I would say is I was a member of the first women's caucus in the Pakistani parliament. And what happened in that was you had people from the Jamaat-e-Islami, women from the Jamaat-e-Islami who came in fully covered. Then you have people like myself from a more liberal leftist party. And then you had parties in between. And all of us worked together and passed more pro-women and children's bill in our 5-year term, cross parties, treasury benches, opposition across the board, acid crimes bills, harassment in the workplace, across the board. So the power of building caucuses within Parliament also. So I've set out, I think several ways in which parliamentarians, can utilize their time and their voices. And I will just close with one example. I heard news at a certain point. Besides being a member of Parliament, I was the media advisor to the president at that time. And over a weekend, I heard that these clerics in a certain area were in the Friday prayers really whipping up rage and anger against a Christian community that lived nearby, very poor. They were basically to the village of sweepers and janitors. That day, I tried very hard to reach everybody. Nobody was even interested, including the Prime Minister at that time. They didn't care about these lives. I finally got through to the president, but call after call after call, finally we sent in federal rangers. And, there were people and women, children, men who had been burnt alive, but we got in and saved most of the people there. So, it can be one voice or it can be a caucus. It can be the international community, or it can be a local activist like Shahbaz Clement Bhatti, who went on to become the Minister for Religious Affairs. There is such a wide gamut, and I'm just laying all these out because these are things that I used then. And in my advocacy work today, I still use some of these forms. And finally, I would like to tell everyone who's interested, I have a new book coming out called The Politics of Hate, which is a lot to do with the nexus that we're all living in now, which is religious leaders and politicians. And that is the scariest nexus of all. It's the all-powerful nexus. And how to, give equal status to citizens who are not of the majority community, and all of that within this new world, which is every day, I feel is becoming a more and more hostile world. So thank you so much, Ikan, and honored to be on this panel, honored to be an associate member of APHR, and really honored to be on the steering group of IPPFoRB. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Farahnaz. And I'm being mindful of the time. We have 12 minutes, and I still would like to go through our panelists and possibly take a question. Marion, let me turn to you, and then Rob, I'll turn to you. You both as faith leaders and change makers, basically, what insights, what wisdom can you provide us, either as advocates or lawmakers, in making these really remarkable, moves possible?
I would say to not make assumptions. And I would say this is something that every single person can do. I figured I knew who my enemies were and I was going to fight them. I did not realize that these would be my very best partners in the change that I was looking to achieve.
That's brilliant, Marion. Thank you. And Rob, would you like to add to that?
While I won't necessarily be as wise as Marion, I will try to be as brief and simply encourage all of us to appreciate the persuasive and transformational power of relationships on the deeply personal level, to truly get to know even those who are the furthest from us in terms of ideology, worldview, culture, and certainly religion. Go out of our way to get to know someone, to be present in their lives, to listen deeply, and to only absent ourselves when that relationship is no longer possible. I really believe in the transformational power of relationships.
Thank you. You were brief and wise, Rob. And Kasturi, thank you for staying all the way late into the night. But by the way, for full disclosure, I told Kasturi ahead of time, if you had to leave after your first round of comments, feel free to do so. We completely understand, but just see her dedication. Let's hear from you, Kasturi. What would you recommend? Maybe in your with your lawmaker hat, what would you recommend advocates and faith leaders if they want to bring about change?
I think as a lawmaker, the issue is you can have a room of religious leaders and they can all be on the same page on unifying factors or unifying points in religion and what it teaches us. But it's just quite difficult to bring that conversation to the parliament and get lawmakers to sit in a room and talk about it the same way religious leaders do. And I think this is where, when there's the politicking of religion happens, and that is detrimental to freedom of religion and belief. As Honorable Ramakrishnan rightly pointed out, when religion is used as a divisive wedge in society for votes, for elections, for support, for popularity, then it becomes that sort of a commodity that can be abused and used at the same time. My message to lawmakers, including myself, for my colleagues in my parliament, when we address the issue of religion and coming from a structure like Malaysia where you have two different courts, two different laws, is to always put the best interests of, for example, a child, a mother, a father, of society above personal wants and personal needs. And just to share an example, the whole country was caught up in a storm for the past few weeks regarding the forced conversion of 3 children, and it was done unilaterally, meaning that one parent converted the religion of the 3 children to become Muslims. And because Malaysia has apostasy laws, it would be virtually impossible for these children to renounce their faith. But again, being children under the care of their parents, father and mother, means that in the federal constitution, Article 12.4 very clearly states that parent is read as both father and mother. But in Malaysia, because the national language is Malay and the federal constitution is translated to Malay, it states father or mother. And that's where this big, huge debate comes on national language versus the original federal constitution of the country, which states parent, which must be read as both father and mother. So coming back to what has been going on for the past few weeks, a mother lost custody of her children, even when the civil court had ruled that the police retrieve or find these children who had been taken away by the father, that they didn't act on it, that the children were then taken to a northern state in Malaysia, and they were converted to be Muslims. And the mother finally tracked them down, and it was all plenty of tears and crying and a reunion of mother and child. But then you have religious leaders stepping in to say, oh, but Islam is the religion of the Federation, etc. And then just throws the entire conversation of what should be done in the best interest of the child to which camp or which group that's going to win this battle, whether it is the religious group using a religious argument, or whether it is lawyers who say we have to uphold the constitution and the law. And I think these blurred lines are the ones that continue to throw, it's a spanner in the works when you speak about FoRB. So it is so important to not be caught up in this whole drama of even emotional blackmailing, and for lawmakers to speak up when it is most important. And I think there's a problem of a silent majority, or a rather silenced majority, who would stand on the side of the right, of the true, and of the just, but who are not speaking up. And in the case of lawmakers who like to play to the gallery, if the majority is silent, then they would have to listen to the minority that is noisy, who are the extremists and the radicals. And if it is a majority that is silenced, then that's a problem in society and in the country. So I think this is something for the Malaysian narrative it's a lot of soul searching, for lack of a better word, on how Malaysia wants to move forward, and as a country of melting pots of culture and religion and language and food, and this should have been our asset, but in fact it is used as a sort of a divide and rule thing. So to lawmakers out there, it is important to network with other lawmakers. I get a lot of inspiration looking at all the good work that ICAN has done, and people like Faranas and Senator Ramakrishnan, all my other colleagues who are on David, the good work that David has done, Kwang Kwa, and all other MPs who have who had inspired me, who are continuing to inspire me. It is not easy. It is always a case of 2 steps forward and 4 steps back. But what's important is that you keep moving and you keep moving forward. And as you start to speak for everyone to ensure that no one is left behind, you'll be surprised. You might have more MPs to join you, more lawmakers joining you to say, yeah, because I want to be a part of this to ensure that no one is left behind. To IPPFoRB, thank you for taking on this. To speak about moral courage, especially at a time where cowards are also rewarded, being silent is also rewarded, taking sides with the oppressor is also rewarded, that sometimes the road to righteousness is often very difficult, treacherous, and lonely. But seeing everyone here gives a lot of hope. To not just me, and I know fellow lawmakers here and fellow religious leaders here. And I believe that if we are not part of the solution, then we're part of the problem. And I know that all of us here now will have a mission to ensure that we all speak the same language, to be bridges instead of walls. Over the decade, we have seen so many leaders who have become walls. And it was made worse during COVID, during the pandemic. But I think it's time that we recalibrate our mission, to review where we want to be seen or where we stand in this when we speak about FoRB, to speak with conviction, to speak with conscience, to speak for the voice, to be the voice of the minorities, to be the voice of the voiceless, because that's really what counts at the end of the day. With that, I thank again ICAN for giving me this time and this platform to share my 2 cents on FoRB and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasturi. I will shortly hand this over to David, not only for closing remarks, but maybe also for his insights from the Canadian experience. But before that, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or a comment right before that. If not, we're approaching our end time. So David, let me turn to you because I don't see any raised hands. So could you also give us your suggestions, your recommendations based on your own experience in the Canadian House of Commons, and as well as your concluding remarks? But I would like to just end by saying thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to our colleagues in Oslo, Palak, Mariana, Liv, who have made this possible. And it's great to see all the lawmakers, advocates, and faith leaders with whom we have worked over the years. Thank you all. David, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Icon. I'll just be very short and brief on the Canadian experience. One of the things that we did in the House of Commons was brought forward a motion for the Canadian Parliament to recognize and support the principle of religious freedom around the world. And that had never been done before. So it came from a couple of us. It went forward, and I was actually expecting that it may not actually pass because we had indications that a couple of the parties were not going to support it. We did a fair amount of work on it, and the surprise was when it actually came forward to the legislature, it was passed unanimously. So Kasturi's talked about having the courage to speak up, to put things forward or whatever. Often there's a surprising response to that when we do that, and we find out that, okay, people are maybe quiet about this, but they will step forward and support it as well. So that was just one small example of one of the things that we were able to do. I guess just in closing, one of the things I'm reminded of, and I try to mention when I'm talking about this issue, is that every person is a person of faith. Like, we all have beliefs on where we've come from, who we are, and where we're going. And I think if we operate from that perspective, we start to understand we're all in the same boat. And today we've seen such a wide panorama of perspectives, of talking about small children, about youth, about gender issues, about violations of sacred scriptures, violence, and then particularly about the role that power plays in allowing for freedom. And I think often we can get weighted down with these issues, but as I was listening, I was thinking, you know what, FoRB is not about fear. FoRB is about freedom. And if we look at the results and the studies and the evidence, at every point where FoRB is achieved or put forward and has become important to people, it improves things. It improves economic opportunities for people. It improves social conditions for people. It improves health outcomes for people. It improves, as Reverend Rob spoke about, the relationships, personal relationships between people, between communities, between individuals. It gives more educational opportunities, and it creates equality for people. And those are things that every person wants to be part of. Today we heard a lot of people's stories. All of them are unique, but each of them is representative of what so many other people are facing daily. Just to conclude today, I think moral courage, we've talked about moral courage, and it really is the capacity to recognize the realities of human existence, but then also to provide a reason for hope. And I believe that FoRB, properly exercised and put in place, is one of those foundational blocks that we have in order to give people hope and freedom for the most fundamental rights. So I want to thank everyone today.
David, before you wrap up, apparently Chaplain Victoria raised her hand and we didn't see it. Could you give her a time for a quick question or comment? Thank you.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Chair. I'll give it back to you. Please go ahead.
Hi, sorry that I am new into the circle. I'm not a lawmaker, and I'm not a advocate for anyone or any religion, but my professional job is a chaplain. And I happen to begin to attend a lot of different groups. And one thing that I said that is like how discourse between the people believe, and the lawmaker, that's the disconnect. There's so many circles, but not anyone to connect it together. And I hope FoRB will be one of that connection and make it like connected, like integrated into each other. because that's where the discourse is coming from. And when you discourse, you don't communicate, you miscommunication, and all the perception will cause problem. And I think the world right now is all the problem is caused by misperception, and all of that thing happen. And I hope like we will have regular meeting or whatever you have planned, as will bring us together to figure out problem together. Because I know that the head put together, we will achieve what we need to move the society forward. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Chaplain Victoria. Sorry, David, for the interruption. Back to you for the final word.
No, that is entirely fine. It was actually it was a very important point. And that is that I think IPPFoRB, one of the strengths that we've had over the years has been that we've kept a narrow focus on what it is that our major principles are, which is that all people need to be able to believe, to change that belief, and then to live that out. But one of the things that it does is allows people of all political perspectives, all faith perspectives, to be able to come and then to speak with us and to be part of the discussion. As we're building the networks, we're encouraging legislators. Most of them are opposition parliamentarians, it seems. We're trying to encourage them by getting them in touch with civil society, with the people who really feel these issues are important, and then trying to get them to work together. So this notion of FoRB is a positive thing, I think, is something that we need to highlight. We need to find the ways to work together. And this panel today, I think, has been a really good example of that, of people coming together from a wide variety of perspectives, being able to come and agree that every person has that right to believe as they choose, and then to be able to live out those beliefs. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. We're closing almost on time. And thank you particularly to Reverend Schenk and to Reverend Marion for coming out today and joining us on this panel. So thank you. And we look forward to meeting again, hopefully in person. Have a good day.